and every single report said the same thing. The Zero was superior in every way that mattered in a dogfight. The numbers were merciless. Thach's Wildcat could reach a maximum speed of approximately 318 miles per hour. The Zero could hit 331. When both aircraft entered a sustained turn, the Wildcat needed roughly 19 seconds to complete a full circle. The Zero could do it in 14. 5 seconds. That 5-second advantage meant everything. It meant the Zero could get on your tail. It meant the Zero could line up its 20mm cannons and two 7.9mm machine guns. It meant you died while your family got a telegram with words like, "Regret to inform you," and gave his life in service to his country. But the performance gap was even more devastating than raw numbers suggested. The Zero weighed just 5,213 pounds empty, while the Wildcat tipped the scales at 5,658 pounds. That weight difference translated directly into climb rate superiority. The Zero could climb at 300 feet per minute initially, while the Wildcat managed only 303 feet per minute. In practical terms, a Zero pilot could climb away from trouble, gain altitude advantage, then dive back down with energy superiority. The Wildcat pilot had to accept whatever fight the Zero pilot chose to give him. The Zero's wing loading, the ratio of weight to wing area, was exceptionally low at just 107 kilograms per square meter, compared to the Wildcat's 131. This gave the Zero its legendary turning ability. Physics didn't lie. In a sustained turn, the Zero would always win. Always. The only question was how long it would take. John Thach commanded Fighting Squadron 3, 4 pilots, 4 Wildcats, 4 men who trusted him completely to bring them home alive. Their names were burned into his memory: Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Bassett, Ensign Daniel Sheedy, Ensign Edgar Coulson, and Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare when he flew with them. These weren't just names on a roster. They were men with families, with dreams, with futures that depended entirely on Thach finding a solution to an impossible problem. The statistics were devastating. By February 1942, the Pacific Fleet had lost 43 F-4F Wildcats in dogfights against Zeros, 43 experienced pilots. "43 men who'd survived training, survived deployment, survived the journey to combat, only to die in turning fights against an aircraft that physics said they couldn't beat." Each loss followed an identical pattern: documented in report after report. Fleet Command recognized the problem but had no real solution. Orders circulated to all squadrons. Avoid turning engagements with Japanese fighters. Use your speed advantage in dives to escape. The Wildcat could safely dive at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, while the Zero's controls became dangerously stiff above 300 miles per hour. Don't fight unless absolutely necessary. Preserve your aircraft and your life. The orders might as well have said, "Abandon your mission and let the enemy win." Thach led 4 Wildcats that morning, 4 aircraft against 6 Zeros approaching from the north. Standard tactics said they should split up immediately and fight independently. Standard tactics said they would probably lose at least 2 aircraft, maybe 3. Standard tactics said Thach should mentally choose which of his pilots would likely survive and which would probably die. Standard tactics were completely unacceptable to a commander who had promised these men he'd find a way to keep them alive. But Thach had something standard tactics didn't account for. 3 days ago, in his quarters at Naval Air Station San Diego, his wife's care package had arrived. Inside, wrapped carefully between home-baked chocolate chip cookies and letters from home describing their daughter's school play, was a small box of wooden matches. 20 matches in a thin cardboard container. The kind you strike against the rough side to light your stove or your cigarette or the candles at dinner. Simple, common, ordinary. The kind of thing you'd find in any American household. Thach had been sitting at his desk that night, turning the matchbox over in his hands, his mind circling the same impossible problem for the 100th time. The Zero could outturn any American fighter. That was engineering. That was aerodynamics. That was fundamental physics you couldn't change with courage or determination or patriotism. The Japanese had built a fighter that sacrificed pilot protection, fuel tank safety, and structural strength to achieve maximum maneuverability. American engineers had built a fighter that prioritized pilot survival, armor protection, and structural integrity. Both design philosophies were valid, but in a turning fight, the Japanese philosophy won every single time. But sitting there at 11:30 at night, exhausted from another day of training pilots who might die using tactics that didn't work, Thach pulled out 2 matches from the box. He held them parallel to each other, about 3 inches apart, imagined them as 2 aircraft. Then he moved them, not in the same direction like standard formation flying. He crossed them. First match moved right. Second match moved left. They passed each other. Then he brought them back around, crossing from the opposite direction. Right match went left. Left match went right. The matches wove together like a figure 8 lying on its side, never separating, always maintaining mutual support. Something crystallized in Thach's exhausted brain. A possibility, a pattern, a solution that violated every principle in every fighter manual but might actually keep pilots alive. Traditional doctrine was absolute and unquestioned. Fighters operate independently in combat. You might fly together for navigation or mutual support during transit, but when shooting starts, you separate. Every pilot fights his own individual battle. That's how aerial combat had worked since Eddie Rickenbacker and the Lafayette Escadrille in World War I. That's how every training manual said it had to work. That's what every instructor taught to every student pilot. Individual combat separated the aces from the average pilots. It was the test of skill, courage, and aircraft mastery. But staring at those 2 matches weaving back and forth on his desk, Thach thought, what if everything we've been taught is wrong? What if the entire premise of individual fighter combat is fundamentally flawed when facing superior aircraft? What if 2 Wildcats didn't separate when combat began? What if they stayed together like a bonded pair, weaving continuously like those matches? If a Zero latched onto one Wildcat's tail, which would inevitably happen given the Zero's superior turning performance, that Wildcat would turn directly toward his partner instead of trying to outturn the Zero. The partner would simultaneously turn directly toward him. They'd cross paths at high speed, and suddenly the Zero chasing the first Wildcat would find himself flying straight toward the second Wildcat is 6 .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, each capable of firing 750, 850 rounds per minute. The Zero pilot would face an impossible tactical choice. Continue chasing the first target and fly into a wall of bullets from the second Wildcat, bullets that would shred his unarmored aircraft, or break off the attack immediately and lose his firing opportunity. Either way, both American pilots survived the engagement. It was completely insane by every standard of fighter doctrine. It required perfect timing between 2 pilots at 300 miles per hour. It required pilots to fly directly at each other with combined closure speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. It required abandoning decades of established doctrine that had worked in previous wars. It required trust so absolute that your life depended completely on your wingman executing a maneuver neither of you had ever tried in combat. And if the timing was wrong by even 2 seconds, if the geometry was off by even 50 feet, if communication failed, if anything went wrong, both pilots would either collide or get shot down. The risk was enormous. Thach stared at those matches for a long time that night, moving them back and forth, watching the crossing pattern, calculating angles and timing in his head. Then he picked up his phone and called Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare, the same O'Hare who would later become America's first naval ace of World War II and have Chicago's airport named after him posthumously. O'Hare arrived at Thach's quarters 20 minutes later, still wearing his flight suit from evening training exercises. He was one of Fighting Squadron Three's most naturally skilled pilots, aggressive, talented, unshakable under pressure, with reflexes that bordered on supernatural. If anyone could understand what Thach was proposing, O'Hare could. Thach showed him the matches without saying anything initially, explained the concept slowly and carefully, demonstrated the crossing pattern. O'Hare watched silently, his face revealing nothing, his mind clearly analyzing the geometry and physics. When Thach finished explaining, O'Hare stared at the matches for 30 seconds more. Then he looked up and asked just one question. When do we try it? Not will it work, not isn't that dangerous, not what does headquarters think, just when do we try it? 4 days later, at 7:32 a.m. on February 10, 1942, Thach was about to discover if his matchstick theory would revolutionize fighter combat, or get 4 good men killed trying something that violated every principle they'd been taught. The 6 Zeros were now 600 yards away, and closing rapidly at over 300 miles per hour combined speed. Thach's hand moved to his radio transmitter button. He was about to give an order that contradicted everything these pilots had been taught. An order that had never been spoken in United States naval aviation combat history. An order that might be brilliant innovation or might be catastrophic failure that ended his career and killed 4 pilots. His voice cut through the radio static, steady and clear despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Execute weave pattern. On my mark. His wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Bassett, flew 800 feet to Thach's right. Bassett was a solid pilot, reliable, someone who followed orders precisely. 2 additional Wildcats, piloted by Ensigns Daniel Sheedy and Edgar Coulson, maintained formation another 1,000 feet beyond Bassett. 4 American fighters in a loose horizontal line facing 6 Japanese fighters, diving from altitude with overwhelming advantages in speed, maneuverability, combat experience, and aircraft performance. Standard doctrine screamed one word at Thach: separate. Split up immediately, fight independently, trust your individual skill, trust your training. That's what every training flight had taught since flight school. That's what every manual said. That's how you stayed alive according to decades of fighter combat experience. But Thach keyed his radio and spoke words that would change the history of aerial warfare forever. Execute now. Thach turned his Wildcat hard left directly toward Bassett. Simultaneously, Bassett turned his Wildcat hard right directly toward Thach, 2 aircraft accelerating toward each other at combined closure speed exceeding 600 miles per hour. To the Zero pilots diving from above, watching through their gun sights, it must have looked like complete confusion, like panic, like 2 American pilots making a fatal mistake and about to collide in a spectacular mid-air disaster. But Thach and Bassett didn't collide. At 400 yards separation, roughly 4 football fields, both pilots banked sharply in opposite directions. Thach pulled left, Bassett pulled right. They crossed with 200 feet of vertical separation, close enough that Thach could clearly see Bassett's face through his cockpit canopy, and the determination in his eyes, far enough that their propellers never came within dangerous proximity. A figure-8 pattern in 3-dimensional space. 2 aircraft weaving back and forth like those matches on Thach's desk in San Diego, maintaining constant mutual support, never separating by more than 800 feet, always ready to protect each other. The lead Zero pilot selected Bassett as his target. This was standard Japanese fighter tactics refined through years of combat over China. Pick a specific target, commit fully to that target. Use your superior maneuverability to get behind him close to point-blank range where your 20mm Type 99 cannons couldn't possibly miss. Destroy him quickly and efficiently, then move to the next target. The Zero pilot probably expected Bassett to try turning with him, matching him turn for turn. Probably anticipated an easy kill based on countless previous engagements where American pilots had tried exactly that strategy and died within 30 seconds. But Bassett didn't turn away from the Zero trying to escape. He turned toward Thach instead. The Zero followed predictably, exactly as Thach had hoped, closing the distance rapidly. 600 yards, 500 yards, 400 yards. The Japanese pilot had Bassett perfectly centered in his illuminated gun sight. 3 seconds from optimal firing range. 2 seconds. 1 second. Then Thach's Wildcat came screaming through the weave pattern from the opposite direction, appearing suddenly in the Zero pilot's peripheral vision. Suddenly, the Zero pilot confronted an entirely different tactical problem than what he'd expected. He'd been focused completely on Bassett, calculating deflection angles, preparing to fire his cannons. Now there was another American fighter coming straight at him from his 10 o'clock position, and that fighter's 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns were pointing directly at his unarmored cockpit. Thach opened fire at 300 yards, 6 machine guns firing simultaneously, with a combined rate of approximately 70 rounds per second. At that range, at that closure rate, the sky filled with tracers and bullets, a wall of lead stretching across hundreds of feet of airspace. The sound was deafening even over the engine noise. The Zero pilot had exactly 1 second to make a life-or-death decision. Continue pursuing Bassett and fly through Thach's concentrated gunfire, guaranteeing catastrophic damage to his unarmored aircraft, or break off the attack immediately and survive to fight later. He broke off hard right, pulled into a desperate climbing turn, abandoned his attack on Bassett completely. For the first time in Pacific combat, a Zero was running from a Wildcat instead of pressing an attack to the kill. The other 5 Zeros scattered like startled birds. They'd expected easy targets based on months of experience and dozens of successful engagements. They'd expected American pilots flying independently according to doctrine, trying unsuccessfully to turn with them, dying predictably according to established patterns. Instead, they'd encountered something completely unprecedented, something their extensive training over China and the Philippines hadn't prepared them for, something they didn't understand. Sheedy and Coulson had watched Thach and Bassett execute the weave successfully. Now they attempted it themselves with growing confidence. Sheedy turned toward Coulson. Coulson turned toward Sheedy. Another Zero committed to Coulson's tail, closed to 400 yards, began calculating his firing solution. Then Sheedy came through the weave pattern, and the Zero pilot saw what was happening, flinched instinctively, pulled up hard, disengaged completely without firing a shot. The dogfight continued for 6 minutes that felt like 6 hours. 6 Japanese Zeros versus 4 American Wildcats. Under normal circumstances, based on all previous engagements and statistical analysis, the expected outcome would have been 4 dead Americans and 6 Zeros returning to their carrier claiming easy victories for the Emperor. But when those Zeros finally gave up and climbed away toward the northwest, all 4 Wildcats were still flying. Thach checked his fuel gauge, still adequate. Checked his wingman over the radio, all responding, all functional. Nobody hit, nobody wounded, nobody killed. The weave had worked perfectly on its first combat test. Thach landed at Ford Island Naval Air Station 40 minutes later, his Wildcat's wheels touching down on the concrete runway with a slight bounce. His hands were shaking as he unbuckled his harness. Not from fear. The fear had been present during the combat but was now fading. His hands shook from the sudden adrenaline rush of realization washing over him. Maybe American pilots didn't have to die every time they encountered Zeros. Maybe there was a way to survive despite flying inferior aircraft. Maybe a crazy idea involving matchsticks could fundamentally change everything about fighter combat in the Pacific theater and save hundreds of lives. But convincing Fighter Command to abandon decades of established doctrine and embrace an untested innovation was going to be a completely different kind of battle. One fought with paperwork and bureaucracy instead of bullets. Thach filed his combat report that same afternoon, sitting in the operations room with a manual typewriter, carefully documenting every detail. He described the engagement with precise timestamps, explained the weave pattern with detailed diagrams drawn carefully on graph paper, provided exact descriptions of how 2 aircraft could protect each other through coordinated defensive maneuvers, calculated the geometry involved, recommended immediate adoption across all fighter squadrons in the Pacific Fleet. He argued passionately that this wasn't just an interesting tactical variation. It was a fundamental solution to the Zero problem that had been systematically killing American pilots for months. 3 days later, the official response came back from Fighter Command headquarters at Pearl Harbor. Interesting tactical innovation. Requires further comprehensive evaluation and extensive testing under controlled conditions. Not approved for widespread implementation at this time. Further reports requested. Thach read that response 3 times, his jaw clenching tighter each time. Interesting. Requires testing. Not approved. Further reports requested. 43 pilots had died in February alone fighting Zeros using conventional independent tactics, and Fighter Command wanted more testing and more reports before approving something that had worked perfectly in actual combat against real enemies trying to kill American pilots. He crumpled the message and threw it across his quarters in frustration. Then he retrieved it, smoothed it out carefully, and filed it in his personal records. Because someday, when this tactic had saved hundreds or thousands of lives, he wanted documentation showing that he'd tried to implement it immediately and had been delayed by institutional bureaucracy and resistance to change. In the meantime, official approval or not, he was going to teach the weave to every pilot who would listen and was willing to try something new. Because while headquarters was evaluating and testing, American pilots were dying every single day using tactics that didn't work against Zeros. What Thach didn't know, couldn't have known, was that naval intelligence at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had just finished decrypting a series of Japanese radio transmissions using their partially broken JN-25 code. The transmissions revealed something that would change the entire strategic situation. The Imperial Japanese Navy was planning the largest carrier operation in their history. 4 fleet carriers, 270 combat aircraft, hundreds of the best-trained pilots in the world. The target was a strategic island in the Central Pacific that controlled approaches to Hawaii, an island called Midway. The attack was scheduled for June 4, 1942. And when it came, Thach would be flying combat air patrol over USS Yorktown, with 8 Wildcats facing intelligence estimates of 50 or more Zeros, odds that should have been impossible to survive. Between February and June 1942, Thach trained Fighting Squadron 3 on the Weave every single day without exception. Morning flights when weather permitted, afternoon flights, night formations when the moon provided sufficient illumination for safe operations. His pilots flew the pattern until they could execute it instinctively, without conscious thought, purely on muscle memory and training. Turn toward your wingman, cross paths, turn back, cross again. The geometry was simple on paper. The execution at 300 miles per hour with enemy fighters shooting at you was exponentially more challenging and required absolute trust between pilots. The Navy still hadn't officially approved the tactic. Headquarters was still evaluating through some committee process. But Thach wasn't waiting for official approval from people who sat in offices and never got shot at. He taught it to every pilot who would listen at the officers' club, in ready rooms, anywhere pilots gathered. Showed them the matchsticks until the demonstration became famous throughout the fighter community. Drew diagrams on ready room blackboards until his hands were covered in chalk dust. Explained the underlying principle that transformed 2 vulnerable fighters into a mutually supporting team that was exponentially more survivable than the sum of its individual parts. Some pilots grasped it immediately, especially the younger ones without years of traditional doctrine drilled into them. Others were deeply skeptical, particularly senior pilots who'd been flying since before the war. One squadron commander told Thach directly that the Weave violated fundamental principles of fighter doctrine established through decades of combat experience. You can't fly directly at another friendly aircraft during combat. Pilots will panic under fire. Spatial disorientation will cause collisions. You'll kill both pilots simultaneously instead of just losing one. But Thach kept teaching relentlessly, because conventional tactics kept killing pilots with predictable regularity. By May 1942, American forces in the Pacific had lost 91 Wildcats in combat with Zeros, 91 funerals with folding flags, 91 families permanently destroyed, 91 telegrams delivered by solemn officers who had to watch mothers and wives collapse in doorways. And Fighter Command continued issuing the same inadequate orders. Avoid engagement when possible. Run if outnumbered. Use your dive speed to escape. Survive to fight another day. Those orders might as well have said, surrender the sky and let the Japanese win. Then on May 21st, Naval intelligence confirmed Japanese plans with high confidence based on multiple decrypted messages. Midway Island. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. 270 aircraft including the dreaded Zeros. June 4th. Admiral Chester Nimitz called every available carrier to Pearl Harbor immediately for emergency briefings. He had 3 operational carriers, USS Yorktown, which had just been rapidly repaired after Coral Sea damage, USS Enterprise, and USS Hornet. The Japanese had 4 carriers, plus 2 years of intensive combat experience across China and the Pacific, plus Zeros that could outfly anything America possessed in turning combat. The strategic mathematics were nightmarish. American carriers were outnumbered 4-3. American pilots were significantly less experienced on average. American fighters were demonstrably slower and less maneuverable. The only advantages America had were exceptional intelligence work that gave them strategic surprise, somewhat better dive-bombing doctrine, and tactics, and one unproven tactical innovation involving matchsticks that official doctrine still hadn't recognized as valid. Fighting Squadron 3 received deployment orders on May 26th. Report to USS Yorktown immediately. Prepare for carrier operations. Combat expected within 7 to 10 days. Expect heavy enemy resistance. Thach read those orders and understood their implications with perfect clarity. His squadron would be protecting Yorktown from Japanese Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, while simultaneously fighting Zeros for air superiority. They would be significantly outnumbered. They would be flying inferior aircraft against superior enemy equipment, and they might all die unless his matchstick trick actually worked when tested under the most extreme combat conditions imaginable. He gathered his pilots that evening in the ready room. 7 men, 7 Wildcats, 7 lives depending entirely on an unproven tactical innovation involving matchsticks that Navy headquarters still considered interesting but not approved for general implementation. Thach showed them the matches one final time, explained the weave pattern one final time, made them practice the crossing geometry using hand signals and models. Then he told them the absolute truth without sugarcoating anything or providing false comfort. Intelligence estimates the Japanese are bringing 50 Zeros to Midway, possibly more depending on their carrier aircraft distribution. We'll have 8 Wildcats assigned to Yorktown's combat air patrol. Possibly fewer if Enterprise or Hornet lose aircraft before the main battle, or if we have mechanical issues. The only way we survive this is the weave. The only way we protect Yorktown from dive bombers is the weave. The only way we accomplish our mission and come home alive is the weave. One pilot, young Ensign Coulson, who'd just turned 22 years old, asked the obvious question everyone was thinking but nobody wanted to voice. "Commander, what happens if we execute the weave perfectly, and the Zeros shoot us down anyway? What if the tactic doesn't work when we're that badly outnumbered and they adapt their tactics?" Thach didn't have a comforting answer prepared. He couldn't guarantee success or survival. He couldn't promise that courage and innovation would overcome numerical and performance disadvantages. He could only show them the matches again. Show them how 2 matches weaving together could protect each other, could survive together when surviving independently was mathematically impossible. USS Yorktown sailed from Pearl Harbor on May 30th, 1942. 4 days transit to the Midway operational area. 4 days until the battle that would determine control of the Pacific Ocean for years to come. 4 days to pray that matchsticks could stop Zeros, and that American dive bombers could sink Japanese carriers before those carriers launched enough strikes to destroy the American fleet. June 4th, 1942, 9:30 a.m. Thach was at 14,000 feet above Yorktown, circling in combat air patrol station, when the ship's CXAM radar detected incoming aircraft. The Japanese first strike wave appeared minutes later through scattered clouds. 18 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers in formation, escorted by 12 Zeros flying top cover. Not 50 Zeros. Not the massive, overwhelming formation intelligence had predicted based on carrier aircraft capacity. But 12 Zeros against Thach's 4-plane section still created 3-to-1 odds with aircraft that had superior performance characteristics in turning combat. The Zeros came in high at 15,000 feet, establishing altitude advantage according to standard Japanese doctrine. Standard tactics that had worked successfully in countless previous engagements. Dive on American fighters from altitude. Use speed and superior maneuverability to dominate the engagement. Destroy them quickly before they can threaten our bombers. Thach counted aircraft rapidly, calculating odds and geometry. 4 Wildcats, 12 zeros, 3-to-1 odds. He keyed his radio. Weave pattern. Execute on my mark. Stay with your wingman no matter what happens. Trust the pattern. Lieutenant Junior Grade Bassett was 600 feet to his right. 2 more Wildcats positioned behind them in supporting positions. The Zeros dove aggressively, splitting into groups to attack multiple targets. Thach watched them select targets and commit. 3 Zeros broke directly toward him. 4 went after Bassett. The remaining 5 continued toward Yorktown to engage other defending fighters and clear a path for the dive bombers. Thach gave the order that would test everything he'd developed over 4 months. Mark, execute now. He turned hard toward Bassett. Bassett turned hard toward him. They crossed paths at 12,000 feet, the weave pattern forming perfectly. The 3 Zeros chasing Thach suddenly confronted an unexpected tactical problem they hadn't encountered before. Their target was flying directly at another Wildcat, and that Wildcat's guns were pointing straight at them in a head-on firing position. The lead Zero pilot hesitated for just 2 seconds, trying to understand what he was seeing. But 2 seconds at combat speed equals 400 yards of closure distance. Thach came through the weave and opened fire with all 6 machine guns converging at 300 yards. His .50 caliber armor-piercing and incendiary rounds tore through the Zero's engine cowling, shredding the Nakajima Sakai radial engine and destroying critical components. The Zero rolled left violently, trailing thick black smoke, and fell away, spinning toward the ocean below. Thach's first confirmed Zero kill, but the other 2 Zeros didn't break off or flee. They'd observed the weave pattern carefully for those few seconds. They'd analyzed it quickly with the tactical intelligence of experienced combat pilots, and they adapted their tactics immediately to counter it. Instead of committing to Thach's tail in a traditional stern chase that would take them through the weave, they split vertically. One went high, one went low. They attacked from different vertical angles simultaneously, forcing Thach to choose which threat to counter, while leaving himself vulnerable to the other. A classic tactical dilemma designed to break the mutual support. Thach pulled into a climbing turn toward the high Zero, deciding that was the more immediate threat. Bassett broke hard toward the low Zero to cover that angle. The weave pattern fractured for several critical seconds. Both Wildcats were fighting independently, exactly what Thach had tried to prevent. Exactly what traditional doctrine would have done. Exactly what got pilots killed. The high Zero achieved guns on target at 800 yards. His 20mm Type 99 cannon fire walked up Thach's left wing, the explosive rounds detonating on impact. 2 rounds punched through the wing root, destroying structural components and control cables. 1 round went through his cockpit canopy, missing his head by 3 inches. Thach felt the shockwave, felt the sudden decompression, felt aluminum fragments pepper his flight suit and goggles. Kept turning aggressively, refusing to give up. Bassett's voice cut through the radio, strained and urgent with pain evident. I'm hit. Repeat, I'm hit, taking significant damage, engine temperature rising. Thach looked left quickly. Bassett's Wildcat was trailing white smoke. Coolant leak from the Pratt & Whitney engine. Possibly worse damage. The low Zero was still on his tail, hammering him with sustained machine gun fire, walking rounds up his fuselage toward the cockpit. Thach made his decision instantly, abandoned his turn toward the high Zero despite that threat continuing. Dove aggressively toward Bassett. The weave had broken temporarily under the coordinated attack, but the fundamental principle still worked. Position yourself between your wingman and the threat attacking him. Mutual support over individual survival. Thach came down on the low Zero from 7 o'clock high. 600 yards, 500, 400. He opened fire with all guns, holding down the triggers. The Zero exploded catastrophically, the 20mm cannon rounds in its wing roots detonating sympathetically. Pieces of wing and fuselage tumbled through the air, trailing fire and smoke. Bassett's Wildcat was shaking badly, losing altitude steadily, the engine clearly failing. He called over the radio, voice tight with pain. Engines overheating critically. Temperature past red line, returning to Yorktown immediately before it seizes. Thach told him go without hesitation, ordered the other 2 Wildcats to escort him back to the carrier, providing protection during his vulnerable return. That left Thach completely alone at 11,000 feet, with 10 Zeros still in the immediate area hunting for targets. The weave worked brilliantly with a wingman providing mutual support. Without a wingman, Thach was just another Wildcat pilot trying not to die against aircraft with superior performance. 3 Zeros spotted him isolated, turned to intercept aggressively, seeing an opportunity for an easy kill. Thach looked around desperately for friendly fighters, saw 4 Wildcats from another squadron 3 miles east. Too far to help in time, too far to form up with. The 3 Zeros were closing rapidly at high speed. Thach had no wingman, no weave, no apparent options except run, dive away at maximum speed and hope his structural strength held, while the Zeros' controls stiffened at high speed. But running meant leading Zeros directly toward Yorktown, leading them toward the carrier his squadron was assigned to protect. That was unacceptable. He keyed his radio, called for help from any friendly fighters in range, told the other Wildcats he was engaging 3 Zeros solo for anyone listening, told them if the weave principle worked, they'd see proof of concept. If it didn't work, someone should tell his wife in San Diego that he loved her and died trying to protect his ship. Then Thach turned his Wildcat directly toward 3 Zeros and prepared to test whether matchstick geometry could save one pilot fighting completely alone against impossible odds. Thach was at 9,000 feet when the 3 Zeros reached firing range. He was completely alone. No wingman to weave with, no support from other aircraft. But he'd spent 4 months thinking deeply about the weave, 4 months understanding the underlying geometry and physics, and suddenly he realized something crucial that changed everything. The weave didn't absolutely require 2 physical aircraft. It required 2 points in space that forced the enemy to react and make choices. He turned hard right, then immediately reversed hard left before the turn was complete. Sharp angular turns, not the smooth, sustained turning fight Zeros expected and excelled at. The lead Zero committed to following Thach's right turn, pulling hard to match the maneuver. But Thach was already reversing left aggressively before the Zero could complete his turn. The Zero pilot had to correct his turn, had to pull harder on his stick, had to burn precious energy. Thach did it again immediately, not giving the Zero time to predict. Right turn, left reversal. The Zero followed right. Thach went left. The Japanese pilot was always half a second behind, always correcting, always reacting instead of acting, always responding to Thach's initiative instead of dictating the fight. And every correction cost airspeed, cost energy, cost the altitude advantage that Japanese tactics depended on for success. After 40 seconds of constant unpredictable reversals, the Zero was at the same altitude as Thach. Same airspeed, same energy state, no advantage remaining, no superior position, just 2 aircraft in neutral positions. The Zero pilot recognized he'd lost his advantage and broke off contact. Climbed away rapidly to regain altitude advantage. The other 2 Zeros followed him, unwilling to commit without advantage. Thach had just proven something critically important through desperate innovation. The weave principle worked even without a physical wingman providing mutual support. Sharp reversals, constant unpredictable direction changes. Never let the enemy predict your next move. Make them react constantly. Make them bleed energy chasing your maneuvers. Make them quit the fight in frustration. He landed on Yorktown 22 minutes later, his Wildcat's damaged wing making the landing challenging. Bassett was already aboard. His Wildcat had taken 4 serious hits, but the rugged Pratt & Whitney R1830 engine held together long enough to reach the carrier, a testament to American engineering philosophy that prioritized reliability and survivability. The other pilots from Fighting Squadron 3 were debriefing in the ready room, talking animatedly about what they'd witnessed. They'd all seen Thach's solo fight against 3 Zeros, all watched him survive completely alone using innovation and tactics instead of superior aircraft performance. Word spread through the fighter squadrons rapidly that afternoon like wildfire. Thach's weave works, even solo, even outnumbered 3-1, even when the enemy adapts their tactics. By evening, pilots from Enterprise and Hornet were finding Thach in the officers' mess and asking him to explain the tactic in detail so they could try it. He showed them the matches again, drew detailed diagrams, demonstrated the reversals using his hands as visual aids. Some pilots tested it that night during practice flights over the task force, pair formations over the carrier groups, practicing the weave under safe conditions, learning the precise timing that meant the difference between effective mutual support and dangerous collision. By June 5th, 18 Wildcat pilots could execute the pattern competently. By June 6th, 32 pilots across the 3 carriers. The weave was spreading through the fleet faster than any official doctrine had ever spread through formal channels. Proof that good tactics spread naturally when pilots recognize something that might keep them alive. Japanese pilots noticed the change in American tactics quickly. Radio intercepts from June 7th, intercepted by American monitoring stations, included references to modified American combat methods. American fighters flying in coordinated pairs. American fighters executing unpredictable defensive maneuvers. American fighters that refused to die according to established patterns that had worked for months. One intercepted message from a Japanese fighter commander stated, "American Wildcat pilots have significantly changed their combat methods. Expect increased resistance in future engagements. Exercise caution when pursuing isolated targets." On June 10th, Fighting Squadron 3 flew combat air patrol over a resupply convoy near Midway. 8 Wildcats in 4 pairs. 14 Zeros attacked from altitude with numerical superiority. Thach called the weave over the radio. All 4 pairs executed simultaneously with practiced precision. The Zeros tried their standard proven tactics that had worked successfully for months. Tried to isolate individual Wildcats. Tried to use their superior maneuverability to achieve killing positions through sustained turning. But every time a Zero committed to a Wildcat's tail, that Wildcat turned directly toward his wingman. Every time the Zeros tried to split a pair by attacking from different angles, both Wildcats turned toward each other, maintaining mutual support. The pattern held perfectly under combat pressure with live ammunition. After 12 minutes of intense combat, the Zeros broke off and withdrew toward their base. They'd managed to damage 2 Wildcats with minor hits but scored 0 kills. The Americans had shot down 3 Zeros. 3 confirmed kills with wreckage observed hitting the water. The first time in Pacific combat that Wildcats had achieved a clearly positive kill ratio against Zeros in a major engagement with significant numbers involved. Fighter Command finally took serious notice when the combat reports reached Pearl Harbor. On June 15th, Commander John Thach received orders to report to Pearl Harbor immediately on the next available transport. Report directly to Admiral Chester Nimitz. Prepare a comprehensive formal briefing on the weave tactic for senior leadership. The Navy wanted to evaluate whether this matchstick trick should become official doctrine across the entire Pacific Fleet, or remain an interesting local innovation. Thach arrived at Pearl Harbor on June 18th, carrying a briefcase full of documentation. He spent 2 full days preparing the briefing meticulously in a conference room, working late into the nights. Compiled detailed diagrams showing aircraft positions, combat gun camera footage when available, written pilot testimonials from multiple squadrons, kill ratios comparing pre-weave and post-weave performance, survival statistics that showed dramatic improvement. Everything Command needed to see conclusively that the weave worked and should be adopted immediately. But while Thach was preparing his briefing for American Command, Japanese naval intelligence staff officers were preparing something else. They'd carefully analyzed reports from returning pilots about the new American tactics, studied the weave pattern from pilot descriptions and debriefings, identified its strengths and potential weaknesses through careful analysis, and they'd developed a counter-tactic, coordinated attack method, designed specifically to break the weave by attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. A way to overwhelm the mutual support and kill both Wildcats before they could protect each other. On June 21st, Thach would brief Admiral Nimitz on the weave's demonstrated effectiveness. But on June 23rd, Fighting Squadron 3 would face 18 Zeros over Santa Cruz Island during a convoy escort mission. And those Zeros would be using tactics specifically designed to destroy Thach's innovation and prove that American pilots still couldn't defeat Japanese aircraft superiority. June 23, 1942, 8:15 a.m., Santa Cruz Island. Fighting Squadron 3 was escorting a supply convoy carrying critical supplies to Guadalcanal when radar operators detected contacts. 18 bogies inbound from northwest, distance 12 miles, altitude unknown, speed high. Thach counted his Wildcats over the radio net. 8 aircraft, 4 pairs, standard weave formation that had worked in previous engagements. He'd briefed Admiral Nimitz 3 days earlier in a conference room at Pearl Harbor. Nimitz had personally authorized field testing of the weave across all Pacific fighter squadrons after reviewing the evidence. Now Thach was about to discover that the Japanese had analyzed his innovation carefully and developed sophisticated countermeasures designed to exploit potential weaknesses. The Zeros came in at 16,000 feet with altitude advantage. But they didn't dive immediately according to standard doctrine that dictated using altitude advantage before it could be countered. They circled slowly at altitude, waited in formation, coordinated. Thach watched them orbit for 90 seconds through his canopy. Highly unusual behavior that triggered warning bells in his tactical mind. Zeros always attacked immediately in every previous engagement. Always used their altitude advantage as quickly as possible before Americans could climb to challenge them. But these Zeros were waiting, coordinating, planning something new. Then Thach understood what he was seeing with growing concern. The Zeros were setting up a coordinated multi-axis attack designed to overwhelm defensive tactics. 6 Zeros broke left in formation, 6 broke right, 6 stayed high. 3 groups of 6 aircraft, 3 different angles of attack, 3 simultaneous threats. They'd studied the weave carefully from returning pilot reports. They knew 2 Wildcats could effectively protect each other from threats coming from one direction. But 3 directions simultaneously attacking from different angles? That was an entirely different tactical problem that might break the mutual support system. The coordinated attack commenced at 8:17 precisely. 6 Zeros from directly above diving vertically. 6 from the left flank coming in horizontally. 6 from the right flank mirroring the left group. 3 groups attacking simultaneously from 3 different directions. Thach called the weave immediately over the radio, but his pilots hesitated momentarily, confronting a tactical dilemma they hadn't trained for. Which threat do you counter when threats are coming from 3 directions simultaneously? How do you maintain mutual support when you're being attacked from multiple angles? Lieutenant Bassett chose to counter the high Zeros diving from above, turned into them aggressively to meet the threat. But that exposed his right flank to the right side group approaching from that direction. Ensign Sheedy recognized the problem and turned to cover Bassett's exposed right side. But that broke the weave pattern with his own assigned wingman, leaving both pairs vulnerable. Suddenly, all 4 pairs were fragmented under the coordinated assault. 8 Wildcats fighting independently without mutual support. Exactly what the Japanese wanted. Exactly what the coordinated 3-axis attack was designed to achieve. Break American mutual support and force them back into individual combat where Japanese aircraft superiority would dominate. Thach saw it happening in real time, watching his innovation being countered. Saw the weave collapsing under the coordinated pressure. Keyed his radio urgently, voice sharp with command authority. Reform pairs immediately. Lock onto your assigned wingman. Execute standard weave. Ignore the other groups. Trust your wingman to cover your defensive sector. His pilots heard him through the chaos of combat. Bassett turned hard toward his wingman, abandoning his attack on the high Zeros. Found him in the chaos, locked in visually. They executed the weave even with Zeros attacking simultaneously from multiple directions, trusting the principle even when threatened from multiple angles. The high Zeros dove aggressively at over 400 miles per hour. Bassett turned toward his wingman as they approached. The Zeros followed predictably, committed to their attack runs. Flew directly into his wingman's guns coming through the crossing pattern. 2 Zeros exploded under concentrated fire. The others pulled up hard, abandoning their attacks. The left group tried next, attacking from the flank. Came in at 14,000 feet in formation. Thach and his wingman executed the weave precisely despite the confusion. 1-0 committed fully to the attack, flew through the crossing pattern without seeing the trap, took concentrated, 50 caliber fire through the cockpit, fell away trailing smoke and fire, pilot clearly dead. The right group attacked Sheedy's pair with similar tactics. Same result despite their numerical advantage. Weave held under pressure. 0 crashed into the ocean below. After 8 minutes of intense combat, the Japanese had lost 5 Zeros with pilots either dead or forced to ditch. The Americans had lost 0 Wildcats. The coordinated 3-direction attack had failed completely, despite good planning. The Zeros climbed away and withdrew toward their base. But Thach knew something critically important had just occurred in this engagement. The Japanese had adapted quickly. They'd studied the weave carefully from combat reports and pilot debriefings. They'd developed sophisticated counter-tactics based on sound tactical analysis. The fact that the counter-tactics failed didn't diminish their significance. What mattered strategically was that Japanese command was taking the weave seriously enough to train pilots specifically to defeat it and develop countermeasures. That evening, Thach filed another detailed combat report with precise times and descriptions. Described the coordinated 3-direction attack and how it was intended to work. Described how the weave held even under sophisticated multi-axis assault when pilots maintained discipline. Recommended immediate widespread adoption throughout the fleet. No more testing, no more evaluation, no more bureaucratic delays. The weave worked against standard tactics. It worked against adapted counter-tactics designed specifically to defeat it. It worked, period. Lives depended on immediate implementation. The report reached Admiral Nimitz on June 25th. Nimitz forwarded it immediately to Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet. King read it carefully, read the kill ratios showing dramatic improvement. Read the survival statistics that were dramatically better than anything American fighters had achieved previously against Japanese Zeros. 0 American losses, 5 Japanese losses, 8 Wildcats versus 18 Zeros. Better than 2-to-1 odds overcome completely through tactics and discipline, rather than superior equipment. On June 29, 1942, Admiral Ernest King issued Fleet Order 41, 1942. All fighter squadrons in the Pacific Fleet would immediately adopt the Thach weave as standard combat doctrine effective immediately. Mandatory training for all pilots within 2 weeks. Mandatory execution in all combat engagements. Squadron commanders would be held accountable for implementation. The matchstick trick was now official United States Navy tactics. But orders issued from Washington headquarters took time to reach every squadron scattered across the vast Pacific. Time to receive the orders by radio or mail. Time to train pilots. Time to practice the pattern until execution became instinctive. And the Japanese weren't waiting politely for Americans to complete their training cycle. On July 7, 1942, over Guadalcanal, 32 Zeros would attack 12 Wildcats from 6 different squadrons in a major engagement. Some squadrons knew the weave and had trained on it. Some didn't know it at all. And the ones that didn't would learn the hard way why Thach had been teaching matchsticks for 5 months. July 7, 1942, Guadalcanal. 12 Wildcats from 6 different squadrons flew combat air patrol over Henderson Field, protecting bombers and ground installations. 4 pilots had received formal training on the Thach weave. 8 had not received any training at all and didn't know it existed. At 11:20 a.m., 32 Zeros appeared from the north in a massive formation, nearly 3-to-1 numerical odds. The 4 pilots who knew the weave immediately paired up automatically without orders, executed the pattern based on their training. The 8 who didn't know it fought independently using traditional 1-versus-1 dogfighting tactics that had failed for months. 22 minutes later, when the combat ended, 6 Wildcats were shot down. All 6 were pilots who fought independently using conventional tactics. The 4 pilots using the weave survived without any damage to their aircraft. They claimed 7 confirmed 0 kills between them, nearly 2-to-1 ratio in their favor despite being heavily outnumbered. Admiral William Bull Halsey read that combat report and the stark difference in outcomes. He immediately issued emergency orders. Every single fighter pilot in the South Pacific would learn the Thach weave within 2 weeks maximum. No exceptions, no delays. Squadron commanders who failed to implement training would be relieved of command. Intensive training programs started on July 10th across the theater. Thach flew directly to Guadalcanal on a transport aircraft, spent 3 full weeks teaching the weave to every squadron on the island personally. Morning briefings starting at 600, afternoon flight training, evening debriefs analyzing the day's practice flights and correcting errors. He showed pilots the matchsticks repeatedly until everyone understood the principle. Drew the diagrams on blackboards until his hands cramped from holding chalk. Flew demonstration patterns until his aircraft needed maintenance from the hours of flight time. Some pilots learned quickly in 2 days. Others needed a full week of practice. But every single pilot learned eventually. By August 1st, 96 Wildcat pilots could execute the weave competently under combat conditions. By September 1st, 214 pilots across the Pacific Theater. The tactics spread from the Pacific to the Atlantic Theater, from carriers to land-based squadrons, from Wildcats to other aircraft types. P-38 Lightning Squadrons started adapting it for their twin-engine fighters. P-40 Warhawk squadrons. Even some bomber formations adapted the crossing pattern for defensive purposes against fighter attacks. The results were immediate and statistically dramatic across the theater. In June 1942, before the weave became standard doctrine, American fighters had a kill-to-loss ratio of 0.44 to 1 against Zeros. For every 10 American fighters lost, Americans shot down approximately 4 Zeros. Losing ratio. By October 1942, after widespread weave adoption, the ratio was 2.1 to 1. Americans were shooting down 2 Zeros for every Wildcat lost. The advantage had completely reversed through tactics alone without any change in aircraft performance. Japanese pilots hated it intensely. Radio intercepts from September showed Japanese squadron commanders issuing urgent warnings to pilots about the American crossing pattern. Do not commit to extended tail chase. Do not follow American fighters into their wingman's guns under any circumstances. Disengage immediately if Americans execute coordination tactics. Maintain altitude advantage. But disengaging meant losing the fight. Meant letting American fighters protect their bombers successfully. Meant surrendering air superiority over critical areas. Meant strategic failure. The Zero was still faster and more maneuverable than the Wildcat in pure performance. Those physical advantages hadn't changed. Physics and engineering were still physics and engineering. But speed and maneuverability meant nothing if you couldn't achieve a safe firing position, and the weave made achieving firing positions nearly impossible without accepting unacceptable risks. By January 1943, the weave was standard doctrine across all United States fighter squadrons in every theater. Army Air Forces adopted it officially. Marine Corps adopted it. British Royal Navy pilots started learning it for operations from their carriers. The tactic that started with 2 matches on a desk in San Diego had become the foundation of Allied fighter doctrine worldwide. Thach received the Navy Cross in February 1943. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in the development and implementation of fighter tactics that have saved numerous American lives and contributed significantly to the success of United States naval aviation operations throughout the Pacific Theater of Operations." But Thach didn't care about medals or recognition or career advancement. He cared about one number above all others. In the 6 months before the weave became official doctrine, the Pacific Fleet lost 137 Wildcats in combat with Zeros. In the 6 months after the weave became mandatory doctrine fleet-wide, the fleet lost 41 Wildcats total. 96 pilots who came home alive because 2 matches could cross paths. 96 families who didn't receive telegrams. 96 funerals that never happened. Fighter Command assigned Thach to training duty in March 1943. Pulled him from combat operations permanently. Sent him back to Naval Air Station San Diego specifically to teach the weave to new pilots entering the fleet, before they deployed to combat zones. He hated being away from combat initially, hated feeling useless while the war continued and his former squadron mates were still fighting. But command told him directly that he was far more valuable as an instructor than as a combat pilot. More valuable teaching the innovation to hundreds of pilots than using it himself against a handful of enemies. Thach trained pilots for 18 months straight without break. Taught the weave personally to over 800 naval aviators. Every one of those pilots took the tactic to combat theaters across the Pacific and Atlantic. Every one of them survived situations they shouldn't have survived using conventional tactics. And every one of them told other pilots about the commander who saved their lives with matchsticks. The war ended in August 1945. Thach was 40 years old. He'd flown 73 combat missions total, scored 6 confirmed kills personally, received the Navy Cross, 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and 3 Air Medals for his combat service and tactical innovation. But none of those statistics compared to the number that actually mattered to him personally. Over 2,000 American pilots survived World War II specifically, because they knew how to execute the weave pattern under combat conditions. After the war ended, Thach faced a difficult personal choice: stay in the Navy or return to civilian life. His wife wanted him home after 4 years of war. His children barely knew him as a father. He'd been gone for 4 years fighting and teaching while they grew up. But staying in the Navy meant continuing to teach, continuing to save lives through education and innovation, continuing to ensure the lessons learned in blood weren't forgotten. John Thach stayed in the Navy. He couldn't walk away from teaching pilots who needed to survive. He spent the next 27 years training fighter pilots, developing new tactics, saving lives without firing another shot in combat. The Navy promoted him steadily. Commander in 1946, Captain in 1952, Rear Admiral in 1960, 4 stars eventually. He commanded carrier groups during the Korean War. Never flew combat missions again personally. But his pilots did, and every single one of them knew the weave. Korean warfighter pilots called it the Thach, officially in all documentation and radio calls. No other tactical innovation in military aviation history carried a pilot's name while he was still alive and serving actively. During Vietnam, the weave evolved for jet combat at supersonic speeds. F-4 Phantom pilots adapted it for much higher speeds, called it Fluid 4 formation. Same fundamental principle, same crossing pattern protecting wingmen, different speeds and altitudes and weapons. American pilots used it successfully against North Vietnamese MiG fighters. The MiG-17 could outturn the F-4 Phantom, just like the Zero outturned the Wildcat 30 years earlier. But the weave worked at 600 miles per hour the same way it worked at 300. Physics and geometry don't change with technology. Thach retired from the Navy in 1973, 4-star admiral, 40 years of distinguished service. He moved back to San Diego with his wife, lived quietly, didn't talk extensively about the war, didn't discuss Midway or Guadalcanal or the 2,000 pilots unless specifically asked. When reporters occasionally asked about the weave, he always gave the same humble response: it wasn't genius. It was desperation born from watching good men die unnecessarily. I just wanted my boys to come home to their families. Fighter pilots never forgot him. Every year on February 10th, the anniversary of the first weave combat test, naval aviators from around the country would call Thach, thank him personally, tell him specific stories about how the weave saved their lives or their wingman's life during combat. Thach listened to every single story, remembered every name, wrote personal thank you notes to every pilot who called. The Navy named a building after him in 1981. Thach Hall at Naval Air Station Pensacola, primary fighter pilot training facility. Every naval aviator who earns their wings walks past a bronze plaque with Thach's face and 3 words engraved below: innovate, adapt, survive. John Smith Thach died on April 15, 2004, at the age of 86 years old. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery drew over 300 naval aviators from 5 different generations. Many were in their 70s and 80s. Men who'd flown Wildcats in 1943. Men who'd flown Phantoms in Vietnam in 1967. Men who'd flown FA-18 Hornets during Desert Storm in 1991. Men who'd flown F-35s in the global war on terror. All of them alive specifically because one commander thought creatively about matchsticks, when conventional thinking said nothing could be done to overcome Japanese aircraft superiority. Today, the Thach weave is still taught at every fighter pilot school in the United States military. Navy, Air Force, Marines. Modern versions adapted for fifth-generation stealth fighters and beyond visual range missile combat. But the fundamental principle never changed across 80 years of technological evolution. Two aircraft protecting each other, turning toward each other, crossing paths, surviving together when surviving alone is impossible. The National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, has Thach's original pack of matches preserved in a climate-controlled glass case next to a beautifully restored F-4F Wildcat. The museum label reads, Lieutenant Commander John Thach used these 20 matches to develop the tactical innovation that saved over 2,000 American pilots during World War II. School groups walk past that case every single day. Most don't stop to read the label or understand what they're seeing, but fighter pilots always stop. They look at those matches carefully. They understand exactly what they represent. Because sometimes the difference between life and death isn't superior technology, isn't overwhelming firepower, isn't numerical advantage or better training or more experience. Sometimes it's just one person willing to look at an impossible problem from a completely different angle. One person willing to challenge decades of established doctrine that wasn't working. One person willing to risk his career and his life testing an idea that everyone said was crazy and wouldn't work. One person with two matchsticks and the courage to try something completely new when the old ways were getting people killed. If this story moved you or taught you something valuable about innovation and courage, hit that like button right now. Every single like tells YouTube's algorithm to show this story to more people who need to hear it. These stories matter. These heroes deserve to be remembered. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because we're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single week. Stories about real people who changed history through courage and innovation. Real heroism that actually happened. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from Texas, Germany, Australia, Japan, South Africa, Brazil? Our community stretches across the entire world, and you're part of keeping these memories alive for future generations. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in the military. Tell us what you think about Thach's innovation. Just let us know you're here, and you care about preserving these stories. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure John Thach and the 2,000 pilots he saved don't disappear into silence and forgotten history. These men and women deserve to be remembered forever, and you're helping make that happen by watching, liking, commenting, and sharing.